Hello. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Jenny, and this is a place where I like to talk about all things murdery. So today what I want to talk about is some of my favorite murdery documentaries or based on true story docuseries, not necessarily documentaries or docuseries, but dramatic retellings of based on true stories. Some mixture of fiction and nonfiction. That I think you should be watching. So I'm covering a variety of streaming services, so hopefully there's something in here for everybody. So let's get started. First up on Netflix is a documentary or a docuseries called The Ripper. This is not about Jack the Ripper, which most people I think are at least generally aware of Jack the Ripper. This is about the Yorkshire Ripper, who was Peter Sutcliffe. So if you're in the US, it's entirely possible that you've never heard of Peter Sutcliffe. He was a serial killer that was active in Northern England officially between 1975 until his arrest in 1981. However, there are potentially an additional 22 murders or attempted murderers that have been attributed to him going back to 1965. So the Yorkshire Ripper was believed primarily to target prostitutes. However, that is an assumption that really led the police down a very dangerous path and of narrow focus. And this documentary focuses more on the police investigation and on the victims and their families than it does on Peter Sutcliffe himself. If you're not familiar with Peter Sutcliffe, this will still give you enough general information that you can understand who he was and what he was up to at the time. But it focuses more really on what a disaster, frankly, the police investigation was. So it's helpful to remember this was happening in the 70s. They did not have the benefit of computer technology that we take for granted today or DNA testing or anything like that. But they narrowed their focus so dramatically that they ended up discounting a lot of eyewitness testimony, good eyewitness testimony, because the victims weren't ladies of the evening. Like, oh, you were just a college student who was walking alone at night who was attacked in an identical manner but happened to, for whatever reason, escape. Well, it wasn't the Yorkshire Ripper because you're not a prostitute. And this documentary goes into a huge variety of other narrow focuses that were really poor assumptions that the police were making. I won't go into it all here because you should definitely go and watch the documentary. But I will tell you that the police questioned Peter Sutcliffe at least 9 times prior to his arrest, and many of the police officers raised serious concerns about him. They went to their superiors and said, hey, we need to look into this guy more. And for a variety of frankly crappy reasons based on these poor assumptions, they discounted him and said, no, we're not going to look at this guy anymore. So go watch the documentary. I definitely want to know what you think. I am pretty much in a Peter Sutcliffe phase of my life right now. He is who I'm spending a good amount of time studying. As you will see, if you have watched any of my book talks, you will probably hear me talking about some of these books as well. So tune in for Peter Sutcliffe news here. I don't want to say news. He's definitely no longer active. In fact, he did pass away last year, I believe it was, from COVID-19. Sorry, that's rude. Anyway, next up, moving on. So Hulu. All right, here's the show that I really want to recommend to you on Hulu, and that is The Thing About Pam. However, I did discover when I was preparing this list that the show is now only available with the live subscription, which I find to be outrageously expensive. Like, who is paying for that? If you are paying for it, no judgment. Do what you want with your money. I will not pay for it. I think it's outrageous. Which is such a bummer because that show is fantastic. It stars Renee Zellweger as Pam Hupp, who was just an unbelievably awful woman. So this particular show is a dramatic retelling. It's not a documentary. It's a based on real events retelling. But it's so well done. I've seen other shorter versions of her story in other crime shows that I have watched. And it is one of those scenarios I always tell people when I'm telling them about this person that if you were reading a novel, a crime novel, and you read this as a plot, you would think this was the dumbest book because there's no possible way that it could happen. It's so far-fetched, but it did happen. So if you're not familiar with her story and you don't have the live subscription that is based on a podcast of the same name, The Thing About Pam, go listen to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts and you can listen to it for free. So if you're like me and you're cheap and you still want to watch something cool on Hulu, go watch Only Murders in the Building. It is not based on a true story at all, and it's also kind of ridiculous. I've talked about it on one of my other episodes, so go check that out. It's fun. It's a fun show. It's got Steve Martin, Martin Short, and Selena Gomez, and it's just fun. So there's 2 seasons of that out now if you are too cheap like me to pay for The Thing About Pam. All right, next up, Peacock. So I will tell you that from a true crime perspective, Peacock is the best $5 I spend a month. So I do have to watch commercials, but for $5 a month, I get it. I hate watching commercials, but for $5 a month, I can suck it up. So the show that I'm recommending on Peacock is actually relatively recently released, and it's called The Hillside Strangler, Devil in Disguise. So in addition to all of my fun serial killer research that I do, for fun, one of the things that has really struck me is the number of serial killers that were active in California, specifically in the 1970s. Like, what on earth was going on in California in the 1970s that every other person you met was a serial killer? I feel sorry for the police, honestly, and having had to be investigating that many serial killers, some of whom were overlapping, all in the same areas and at the same time. I know California is a huge state, but still, they, I think it was Henry or Howard, what was his name, Mullins and Ed Kemper were both active in the same area at the same time. How do you manage that as the police? But anyway, I digress. This one follows the story of the Hillside Stranglers. Really, it's considered plural. And that is the story of Kenneth Bianchi and Angela Buono, who were cousins. One of them was adopted, but still, they were cousins. And I think the thing that was really interesting to me about this documentary in particular is all of the research that I've ever done before, all of the reading I've ever done about them before, has definitely identified them as essentially equally culpable. They were partners in crime. They were both convicted of their crimes. They both were the Hillside Strangler. And this show really calls that into question. The show really, really states that no, Angelo Buono was not even involved. I'm not saying he was a good guy, but he was not a serial killer. It was all Ken Bianchi. So it's really interesting to see, to think about that. Was Angelo Buono guilty or not? Because it seems like the biggest evidence they had against Angelo Buono came from Ken Bianchi, and was he just saying whatever the police wanted him to say? The general consensus is a true word has never come out of his mouth. One of the interesting things, too, about this series is that there are a lot of interviews from this with his girlfriend at the time, and it's just really interesting to see her perspective. I think a lot of us find it really interesting to think about what how serial killers manage to have that sense of duality where they are these outrageous monsters preying on random people who just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then they go home and have dinner with their wife and their kids, and they go to work and they have these seemingly normal lives. So I do think it's really interesting to see the perspective of these people who at the time just, no, I had no concerns, right? So Peacock, The Hillside Strangler, Devil in Disguise. Go check it out. Next up on Amazon Prime is Ted Bundy, Falling for a Killer. So this is a documentary that's based on a book called The Phantom Prince, My Life with Ted Bundy, which was written by Elizabeth Kendall, who was Ted Bundy's girlfriend all throughout the 1970s. So she was with him for many, many, many years. I have not read the book yet. It was originally written in 1981, which would have been, at a very fresh time. She did write it under a pseudonym. As you can imagine, you wouldn't want to spend the rest of your life being known as Ted Bundy's girlfriend. But it was recently revised. So I haven't read it yet, but it's on my wish list. I definitely will be reading it. So the interesting thing about this documentary is not only does it tell Bundy's story, but it features extensive interviews with Elizabeth Kendall. It's not just her written story, but she's actually being interviewed. It also features her daughter, Molly, who was a little girl at the time, and she grew up really with Ted Bundy as her primary father figure. They share a lot of family photos at the beach, at dinner, things like that. Think Christmas morning, things that just would look like anybody's family photos. So that kind of circles back. Like, it's just so interesting to think, when you think about Ted Bundy, I mean, if you don't think monster, like, what? But he had this normal life with this sweet, caring woman and a child. It wasn't his biological child, but he was essentially raising her. He taught her how to ride a bike. So I think that's really an interesting perspective on Ted Bundy, to see him in this different light. So I will say, so that one's on Amazon. It's called Ted Bundy, Falling for a Killer. If you are interested in Ted Bundy's story, definitely, once you're done watching the documentary, flip on over to Netflix. I know I gave you a Netflix recommendation anyway, but this is a bonus. And watch Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile. The show is actually called that because that is the description the judge from the state of Florida used when he was convicting Ted Bundy. He described him as extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile. So this is the dramatized version, essentially, of that documentary. And it's another one of those based on true events, as opposed to a true documentary. So it came out in 2019, and if you have not watched it yet, you definitely should. It stars Zac Efron as Ted Bundy. The fabulous Lily Collins plays Elizabeth Kendall. And it has a really fun cameo of Jim Parsons, aka Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory, as the Florida prosecutor, and John Malkovich, who I also think is fantastic. Side note, I first saw John Malkovich in the movie Con Air, and I've loved him ever since. Also, the movie Red, fabulous. Anyway, I digress, but he plays the Florida judge. Also, kind of as a fun cameo, it features Haley Joel Osment, and you will remember him as the cute little boy in literally every movie from the late 90s to the early 2000s. Think Forrest Gump, The Sixth Sense, Secondhand Lions. He was the little boy. So he is no longer a little boy. He is an adult now. So anyway, kind of a fun cameo there. So I really love this documentary. Not only do I think it stays pretty true to Elizabeth's perspective, but I love the acting. I love the cast. And again, I really just like to see this from Liz's perspective. Okay, and then my last recommendation here is on Discovery Plus, which is a subscription I have through my Amazon account, but it is an additional subscription, and that is the Ken and Barbie Killers, The Lost Murder Tapes. So this is the story of Paul Bernardo. This is a documentary. It's not a dramatic retelling. It's a documentary on Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. So they were a very young, traditionally beautiful couple that were residing in Canada. Paul Bernardo came to be known as the Scarborough Rapist. Just blech, gross, like just the grossest dude ever. And he was just a serial rapist that was running rampant through that general area in the 1990s. So when his girlfriend, who later became his wife, Carla, found out about his proclivities, did she turn him into the police? She did not. She joined him. She would later claim that she was abused, and that she was essentially forced to participate. However, the reason this particular show is called The Lost Murder Tapes is that they tape recorded quite a bit of their crimes. And it was very clear that she was an active participant and not being forced to participate. So Paul was convicted of 20 rapes or attempted rapes and 3 murders. Carla was convicted of the 3 murders and at least some of the rapes. So if you're not familiar with their story, I'm not going to tell you anymore here because I have not told you the worst of their crimes, at least in my opinion. The most unfathomable, I should say, of their crimes. So definitely go and check that out. That is Ken and Barbie Killers, The Lost Murder Tapes. The only other thing I will tell you is that Carla Homolka was released from prison at a relatively young age. She was in her mid-30s. She married the brother of her lawyer. They have children, and she is living a free life in Canada. She has absolutely been hounded and treated horribly by people, and I want to feel bad for her, but I don't. So there you go. So anyway, there you go. Those are my my murdery show recommendations. If you have seen this, let me know in the comments. Let me know what you think. If you have other murdery shows that you think that we should be watching, I know Netflix just released a new show on Dahmer, Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer creeps me out. I mean, all serial killers do, but Jeffrey Dahmer in particular creeps me out. I'm pretty sure it's the cannibalism aspect of it, although I know he, again, not necessarily unique in doing that, but he just creeps me out. But that being said, I'm sure I'll still watch the show. So that's kind of next on my murdery show list. So yeah, let me know what you guys are watching, what shows that you would recommend, and if you've seen any of these. All right. In the meantime, as always, have fun, be safe, and don't murder anyone. All right. Bye.